Here's a couple things for you to think through in relationship to the rainbow and God's covenant with us. The rainbow shows us the backdrop of God's grace. The rainbow shows us the backdrop of God's grace. You'll never find a rainbow on a sunny day, will you? You'll never find a rainbow on a sunny day. There will always be some sort of dark, nasty, stormy weather nearby. And often, we don't find the grace of God unless there are storms nearby. Never do we see the grace of God unless there's something that shows us our weakness, shows us our brokenness, shows us our flawedness, shows us our neediness, shows us our sinfulness. The first thing the rainbow is a symbol of is that you'll never find God's grace on a sunny day. Something has to come into your life that shows you your sin. The second thing that the rainbow shows us is the sweeping promise of God's grace. So the backdrop of God's grace and then the sweeping promise of God's grace. It's interesting to think about the rainbow. When do rainbows come? Before it rains or after it rains? Normally comes after, right? Every time you see a rainbow, you should think, it's amazing the rain stopped today. Because it didn't have to. And what I deserve is for the rain to keep coming and for the floodwaters to rise and for me to drown. But the rain stopped today. That's God's grace. Every time a rainbow comes out, it comes out because the rain has ceased to fall, reminding us that the rain should have not ceased falling. The rain should have kept coming. The rain should have kept pouring. In fact, the rain should have kept coming at such a level that it would have drowned all of us. But it didn't. It stopped. And it stopped because God's for us. And God said, never judge the earth like that again. And so the rainbow coming post-rain event is to remind us that the rain shouldn't have stopped, but it did. That too is God's grace to us. Now, when you think about the rainbow, it's interesting. I said it's important in our text. When God says, I've put my bow in the clouds, literally, the Hebrew word for bow there isn't so much like a pretty foo-foo rainbow. It's literally the word that is used later for warrior bows, for the bow of battle. Meaning, the rainbow is a tangible sign of the covenant to us that God has hung up his bow. That God has chosen not to be at war with us anymore. Now you think, how in the world could God hang up his bow and cease to be at war with us when we continue to be at war with him? And this is where Spurgeon enters the picture. And Spurgeon says, the direction the bow is pointing should have clued us into the nature of God's love for us. You ever thought about that? It's not as if the bow is pointing downward, so if God actually slipped, twang, the arrows of his judgment would hit the earth again, right? How could God hang up his bow in ceasing to condemn and judge the world anymore? And Spurgeon says it's not that he's ceased to bring judgment, he simply turned the judgment on himself. And that the bow is not pointed toward the earth, the bow is pointed toward heaven. And that when God releases the arrows of his judgment, he will not release them on man anymore, he'll release them on himself in the person and the work of Jesus. Does that make sense? Meaning when we see the rainbow, it should remind us that we should be dead, but we're not because God's gracious. And it reminds us that there is a judgment coming that we should have deserved, but that God willingly put on himself in his Son Jesus Christ, and all those who place their faith in Jesus Christ can step into the lifeboat, the ark, and not experience the just and right judgment of God's wrath. Rather, they can experience grace and salvation and healing because God takes the wrath himself that you and I deserve. That's what the rainbow means. That's what the rainbow is to remind us of. That God has turned the arrows of his wrath on himself and absorbed it in himself that we might go free. That's amazing.